Hello, Rita, and hello, audience. This is a fabulous conference, and I think you're going to find the next 45 minutes to an hour extremely thought provoking because we get a chance to talk to the fabulous Rita Gunther McGrath. And I think each of you has read at least one of her books, probably more. And I know I have. And where some of the most thought-provoking insights and ideas of the last couple of decades have come from the great mind that sits before us. Just a short introduction of me. I'm Roopa Unnikrishnan, and I've been the Chief Strategy Officer of a couple of technology companies, including Harman and Vontier. And I've tended to work largely in the strategy and innovation world, whether I was at Pfizer, Citibank, BlackRock. I had the pleasure of writing a book and sort of am even more in awe of Professor McGrath. My book was called The Career Catapult, focused on taking innovation practices to use into your own career. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor McGrath. She's a best-selling author. She's a sought-after speaker. She's a longtime professor at Columbia Business School at Columbia Universities. She's recognized as an expert in leading innovation and growth, especially during the times of uncertainty that we find ourselves in right now. She's consistently been named the top management thinker, one of the top 10 management thinkers by the Thinker 50 biannual ranking. She's also a consultant to CEOs, and her work has really made an impact in the lasting strategy and growth programs for her a series of Fortune 500 companies worldwide. She's, as you know, the best-selling author, and one of her latest books, Seeing Around Corners, looks at how to spot inflection points and in businesses before they happen. I know that we all want to do that. Her other books include Discovery-Driven Growth, and she's been cited by Clayton Christensen as creating one of the most important management ideas ever developed. Now, if that isn't enough, if that doesn't keep her busy enough, she's also now taken the step of making these ideas making those extremely implementable by creating Valise.com, her a software-driven business that allows you to plug and play her ideas in your own business. Rita, have I done a decent job of describing all that you do?
Fabulous. Thank you.
All right. So let me jump into the interview part of our discussion here. So the first was really about, like, since the whole discussion today is about ecosystems, what do you see as the role that ecosystems play in strategy today? Because I think we all know that we've had Chirezzos, Chaebels, the Hanseatic League in Germany. They've all been a version of ecosystems at play. But what, if anything, is new in this sort of new evolution of ecosystems that we're seeing? And how do you see it being sort of a practical tool for a strategist?
Well, I think the first observation I would make is that increasingly we're seeing value go from the attributes of a product or a service, how long does it last? How durable is it? That kind of thing. And we're seeing value flowing from attributes like that and toward interactions. So, if I have a purple pen, right, it has a certain value as a purple pen. But if this was a smart pen, like if it knew where it had been and who was writing with it and what it was communicating, it would have infinitely more value than what it actually is. So I think the first reason that we're seeing ecosystems feature much more prominently is that flow of value, that now we're actually using digital data to create value where there wasn't any before. Second thing actually goes back to a very traditional question in management, which is what do you control as a hierarchy? In other words, what has to be within the four walls of your organization, and what can you actually contract for on open markets? And historically, the answer was, well, if the thing you're trading is unknown in value, if you have a risk of opportunism, so you have an information imbalance, if you have a risk of being cheated, if it's hard to establish a price, if all those conditions apply, then you're better off managing it in an organization, in a hierarchy, versus in a market. So if you can establish a fair price, if everybody knows what the price is, if it's not subject to being cheated by, you can ascertain quality and those kinds of things, then you can actually contract for those things on a market. So what's happened with the digital revolution is that things we used to be managing in hierarchies are now being managed in effect by markets. And you only have to look at the labor market to know this, right? If you years ago wanted to hire the world's best, accountant, right? Then you would go out and hire that person and you would bring them on and you'd make them part of your culture and hopefully they'd be with you for a long time. Today, you can hire a fractional piece of the world's best accountant for very little money relative to what you'd have to spend to hire a whole person, and you can do it in a very flexible manner. So we're seeing all these markets for things emerging where previously it just wouldn't have been possible.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about this is that you've really redefined the ecosystem, not just as a company to company interaction, but really sort of a multiplicity. You're talking about individuals, you're talking about subgroups, right? How does that shift the way sort of a company regulates itself or plans for the future? Because I think when we were talking competition, right, company to company competition, there was clarity, there was the rules of engagement. What happens here? What are the new rules of engagement?
Well, it's a fascinating question because more and more we're seeing companies that compete like crazy in some markets and then actually collaborate in others. Samsung and Apple would be a case, right? They viciously compete with each other over patents and in the phone wars, and yet Samsung does a lot of Apple's manufacturing. So very interesting. So we're seeing much more the rise of what some people have called co-opetition. Where you compete in some markets and cooperate in others. We're seeing the need as a strategist. You can't just be thinking about yourself and your own value chain would be a traditional concept in strategy. You've actually got to be thinking horizontally as well. So who else is in your arena? Who else is helping you add value to the customers? And in fact, I would argue the very concept of an industry is now under question. Industry boundaries are getting very blurry. And the traditional rule that, the most significant competitor you face is from your own industry. Well, no, now the most significant competitor you face maybe from some other industry that makes what you're doing unnecessary or irrelevant or less attractive to certain customer sets. So you really need to be having that horizontal look at who else do you need. And it's about ecosystem completeness or ripeness, as I call it. Because what happens if you have an unripe ecosystem is that you can't really get to a point where you're adding value to an end consumer.
Right. And do you see that as the final arbiter of value, the value driven to the end consumer?
In most businesses, yeah. Now, and you do have separations with strictly business to business businesses where you're buying, military hardware or something, where it's not really a consumer that's your end product, but I'd say your end user. You really want to be thinking about, is my offering complete for the end user? A great example of this historically was a company called General Magic. They're very famous in Silicon Valley. A lot of people who are subsequent movers and shakers started off there or were associated with it at one point in time. And they basically invented an iPhone, but they did it in 1985. We didn't have the internet. We barely had cell service. They got it right, but the rest of the ecosystem that would be necessary to make this all happen wasn't there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there is an element of that sort of the clarity that comes from what is the value I or we drive to the consumer. There's a level of clarity there. But how does a policymaker think about an ecosystem? And part B of the question, how does an investor think about an ecosystem? Do they think about do I take the piece that is most valuable? Do I sort of invest in the whole ecosystem? So I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So as investors, you have the choice of investing in multiple companies in an ecosystem. So you could decide, I want to be part of Apple's ecosystem. And so I'm going to invest in Apple plus all the companies that are working with Apple to create these marvelous products. Or you could be thinking about one or more players that are favorably positioned in an ecosystem. So I think one of the things to remember is not all ecosystem partners are equal. There are some that are going to be deriving the lion's share of profits from an ecosystem. So a classic example in history would be Intel and Microsoft basically earning the bulk of profits in the whole PC area because they had the gate factor, right? So the commodity was the hardware, and the thing that really drove a lot of value and scarcity was the combination of the chips and the software. And that's an example of how two members of an ecosystem dominated the profit structures. So that's sort of the investor piece. You want to look at where is this company placed not only within an ecosystem, but are they one of the stronger players? Do they own a critical gating factor? Do they own a critical resource? For policymakers, here's the interesting problem with policy. It lags. It lags reality a lot. And you see it today in the presence of third-party data aggregators, right? So people like Facebook as an example, which take third-party data about you, package it up and sell it off. Well, that was never possible before we had social networks and broadband and the internet as we know it, and inexpensive flows of data. It wasn't a feasible thing. And now that it exists in the world, regulators have to figure out what to do with it, but they've got to understand it first. So most innovations like that take a couple of decades before the regulators really figure out what it is. So for example, what does monopoly mean in a world where companies are giving away their product for free? What? Like, how do I even think about that? Because the traditional standard of monopoly was, you owned a market and you raised prices and that caused consumer harm. Well, how could you possibly be causing consumer harm if you're giving your product away for free? Well, the answer, of course, is they're actually not monopolies. They're monopsonies, and they make their money from people who aren't the direct user. In many cases, it's advertisers or other third parties. But our laws haven't caught up to that yet.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like their innovation, sort of the innovation equation, as it were, has shifted towards the monopsony owners, or is it possible for smaller players actually to drive innovation in this ecosystem-driven mindset?
It's harder. It's harder. And you look at a lot of I'll call them mid-sized tech companies, companies like Basecamp would be an example, who basically say, these big players have so much control over what happens that it's really, really hard to compete with them. I mean, if Google decides to cancel you, how are you going to get the word out about your product or service? So I think right now we're in a very imbalanced stage where a lot of the smaller players struggle. Now, that much being said, we know in life nothing lasts forever. And even though these companies are incredibly dominant right now, there are a lot of smart people who are saying, hey, this is not going to last forever. There's going to be a backlash. Mm-hmm. And I do not think it's unrealistic to think that the power of data aggregation is going to be really challenged. If you look at Facebook right now, they've got literally hundreds of lawsuits. Google the same, basically saying, hey, you innovated around this way of doing business, which is a loophole in the law, and we're going to start closing some of those loopholes. There are a lot of smart people that are saying your personal data should be your data. And one of the scariest phrases is Shoshana Zuboff's phrase, we've entered this era of surveillance capitalism, where your personal actions and artifacts and information are basically being used for somebody else's commercial gain without your permission. And how did we let that happen? Well, we let it happen because we kind of sleepwalked our way into it. Mm-hmm. And I think the tip-off that this is unstable is that all of the big players are basically hiding from people how much of their information they're using. And the most public spat recently came about when Facebook and Apple kind of came to loggerheads because Apple gave people a simple, inexpensive way to opt out. Right. And 70% and more did so. And Facebook said, well, that's going to cost us $10 billion in 2022. I mean, we're talking real money.
Mm-hmm. And not just Facebook, though, because there's Facebook's loss, but the people who were basing their whole business model on access to Facebook. So it's not just the gating authority that loses, but it's that whole ecosystem, right? So so it's sort of like you said, it's dancing on a very, very thin wire right there. What happens inside of companies? Because I think as companies have grown large, right? I remember, I think it was Pete Hamill who said that large enterprise is actually one of the most influential and newest inventions of organizations, right? Because we used to be small and medium sized and quite happy. But inside of a large organization, do you feel like there are practices emerging which feel like they're more than organizations, they're internal ecosystems? And if so, how does one manage that inside of a company if you're, management in such a company?
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing now is the emergence of new ways of coordinating, and I won't call it control, but new ways of coordinating activity, which allow you to create what I call, after my friend Michael Sikorsky came up with this, the permissionless organization. So if you imagine, and Netflix would be another good example where, the senior leadership's job is to very clearly set the context, be clear about the objectives, the strategic goals, that kind of higher level, what are we trying to get done around here? But they really delegate a tremendous amount of decision making to the experts at the edges, making the decisions at the right level of the company, right? Rather than decisions having to flow upward and downward in some kind of convoluted hierarchy, you're able to create, using digital technologies, you're able to create these teams that can make decisions right at the coalface where the customer is.
Right.
And companies that have learned to operate that way, I think that's a competitive advantage, that structural advantage.
Right. And I suspect that there's a cultural, like you said, a cultural element to it, right? You want to make sure that it's not just the rules and regulations and digital technology rights that govern decisions, but the way what you believe and the way you behave.
Mhm. Mhm. So what a lot of these companies that operate in this very fast way do is they use a lot of metrics, which are, this sounds counterintuitive because we're saying, oh, they're getting rid of bureaucracy, but actually they're replacing what used to be a management person with a metrics. And so people can self-monitor. And the metric's not a political player. The metric is telling you what it is, right? So here's a great example of the evolution of a series of metrics. So when Amazon first decided to go into selling things other than books, right, they had to figure out, well, what's going to be our leading indicator for how well we're doing with this? Like, what should we be aiming people to do? And so the first thing that they said was, well, if great selection is one of our strategic pillars, then anything that improves selection should be a good thing. We should do that. And so the first metric that they had was number of product pages. And so, of course, being good Amazonians, the project pages just exploded. There were dozens of them, hundreds of them, but sales didn't go up. So clearly something was missing. So then they said, okay, it doesn't matter if you have a page up. What matters is if a consumer actually looks at it. So the metric evolved into product pages that somebody would take a look at. Okay. And that helped. But what they found then was people were looking at pages, but the item wasn't in stock. So they still didn't make more sales. So the next evolution of the metric was product pages that people look at that have an item that's in stock. And then where they finally landed was product pages people look at, item in stock and available to be shipped within the prime 48-hour shipping window. And then they put that metric in place, and that's what they actually found influenced sales. So I think sometimes when you think about how you organize internally, you have to give a lot of thought to what are we really trying to drive people to? Because a lot of times the reward system and the measurement system actually takes people somewhere else completely.
Right. I'm intrigued by the Amazon example because one of the benefits, let's just say one of the elements of anyone's interaction, whether you love them or hate them, Amazon, right? You sign on for Prime, and then suddenly everything you do has got an Amazon element to it, right? I wonder what that does to brands, though, because I think one of the oft-heard complaints is that whether you're a big brand or a small brand, if you're anywhere near the Amazon world, you're just a person or an element of Amazon strategy, right? So, what is the sort of future of brands in this ecosystem-driven world?
Oh, I think brands still stand for something. A strong brand presence still communicates something about who you are as a company, what your values are. I mean, I think that part of branding is still valid. I think the original part of branding, which was, oh, if you buy, a Procter and Gamble product, it's going to be good quality. I think what's happened today is that kind of branding that sort of is the guarantee of a certain level of safety or quality or something like that. People now make assumptions that that's going to be there.
Right.
That even if it's an off-brand, or a no-name brand, or I want to call it Little Something's shoes or something, we're going to assume that some behind it is some manufacturer with quality standards, by and large. Now, this, by the way, is a big problem for Amazon, because if you buy on Amazon and from many of their third-party sellers, you have no such guarantee. And so what I'm seeing in a really ironic way is people are going to Amazon and picking brands because at least if I buy from, L'Oreal, right, I know it's not going to be some substance that I wouldn't want putting on my lips, you know? And so I think there is that element of where we can be assured the quality is there. We don't need the brands to convey quality as much as we did. But where we can't be assured of that, then we want to go with a known quantity.
Interesting. So it's still a complex. Brands have always been sort of almost part magic and part science, correct? So it's still a little bit of that. um,
Absolutely.
so you've written a lot about partnerships and alliances from what you've experienced and studied, right? What recommendations do you have for a company seeking to adjust their approach towards an ecosystem-oriented world? You're talking like, let's say, sort of old world, it's me and my products, and now a recognition that shifts have to be made. How would you start? How would you go about it?
Well, I think the first thing is to avoid what my colleague Ron Abner, who's at Dartmouth, he calls ecosystems, which is it's got to be about me, 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 me. And what you find is if all the potential players all want to be like the top dog, your ecosystem's never going to take off because you have to have different roles in the ecosystem. And when you're building it for the first time, you have to have almost a generosity of spirit. So if you think about someone like Satya Nadella at Microsoft, big shift from Steve Ballmer at Microsoft. I mean, Ballmer was really all about Microsoft first. I love this company, do or die. And Nadella's been much more willing to play nicely with others. And that's much more conducive to ecosystems. So I think the first thing you have to remember is the metric of success is, do you all create something of value and not, do I own the bulk lion's share of the value? There's smart ways of playing it where you can end up in that favorable position, but nobody's going to want to partner with you if you go into it with that attitude, right? Second thing I think you need to be very aware of is that human relationships don't stay static, right? So you enter into an ecosystem because you think it's going to be great and it does great things for you, but it evolves over time. So a kind of a sad example of that is in the midst of the pandemic, you had the emergence of all these food delivery companies, Grubhub and DoorDash and all those guys. And in the early stages, all these little restaurants that couldn't afford, they can't afford to put up a whole app infrastructure. They're not backed by venture capital. They don't have developers on staff. And so in the early days, this was awesome, right? So DoorDash or somebody would say, I'll give you 10 more orders. And won't that be awesome? And then all the little restaurants said, oh, absolutely. That would be terrific. But if you play that game over multiple cycles, what you now realize is, so I'm a pizza restaurant, let's say, and my neighbor is a Greek restaurant, and down the street's a Korean restaurant. Well, now that all that stuff's aggregated on DoorDash, I'm not just competing with other pizza restaurants. I'm now competing with every possible eatery that's on the app. And the app now controls what the user sees, right? The app, this shouldn't be legal either, but the app can actually be manipulated to show certain preferred solutions, maybe because the restaurant paid them off or something. But the app owners take a huge amount of margin, right, from these. They really don't pay the restaurants very well. They don't pay their drivers very well. And so they've inserted themselves in the middle of this ecosystem. So what looked like a great thing when we first started has now become a real liability, to the point where, there's discussion of legal intervention that certain congressmen and people are saying, hey, this is just not a fair deal, that these data aggregators have inserted themselves in the middle of this previous ecosystem and are now dominating who gets to see what in it.
Right. And I think that's a danger you face in, you used a great example because it's near and dear to all of our hearts, right? Especially during and post COVID. So tell us a little bit about how do you maintain that human element? Because, I do have my favorite pizza restaurant and my favorite Chinese place. I live in Manhattan. And I don't mind paying a little extra because I know, John is going to be there and I'll chat with him and he knows my favorite order. So how does one retain a little bit of that human element from the ecosystem side and also from the consumer side? How do you exert your influence in an ecosystem?
Well, I think that really comes down to, what does the end user perceive as valuable, right? And I think there you need to really understand who your different customer segments are. So, for every one of you that's willing to pay a little bit extra and maybe take a little more time and, maybe chat to the people, and that's your kind of behavior segment, you like that. There are going to be others who are just like, just get me the pizza and within 15 minutes and I got a meeting and I got to go, I can't be on Zoom stuffing my face, whatever it is. So that I think the first question is you really need to understand your customers and develop insight about what's driving their behavior. Then I think you need to be able to let people be people. And I think one of the things that so much of the digital economy has done is really tried to turn people into robots, like badly performing robots at best. And so if I take the example of a large service provider, and I'll pick on Verizon just because they happen to be someone I did business with, I had a series of things that needed to get solved. And doing business with them was just a nightmare. And it was saved, my day was saved by this guy, I'll call him Ken, who was the store manager in one of the local things here. And what Ken was doing was working around every single element of the system that was designed to prevent what I needed to get done from happening. You know, returning some equipment and replacing others and shutting down a number and various other things. But what's happened now is we've tailorized our systems so much that for many people, they're not allowed to be human. You know, they're not allowed to bring themselves to work. And we see it everywhere. So job searches, right? You got the algorithm that says, okay, the job description says I need somebody with 10 years of marketing experience. And the applicant, you know, naively puts in a resume that says 10 years writing copy and producing whatever. And it's marketing experience. The algorithm doesn't know that. Yeah. Now a human being would know that, right? And so we're starting to see, I think, kind of the peaking of our willingness to tolerate this algorithmic dominance of so many decisions that really need to be done by a human being.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is where question of efficiency versus effectiveness and empathy, etc., come into play. And it sort of makes me wonder, do you see ESG, right, the principles of environmental, you know, sort of sustainability, governance, all of those elements, do you see them actually getting somehow subsumed in this digital world, or will we metricize it and actually make them better? Any bets?
Sure. Well, so I think you have to really go back to first principles about capitalism if you're going to talk about ESG goals, because the fundamental problem with environmental impacts is that we have allowed profits to be concentrated and benefits to be broadly dispersed. So we all bear the price of air pollution. You know, we all bear the cost of a degraded environment, and the people that make profits from it are very narrowly concentrated. Mm-hmm. So you've got this kind of broad, very diffuse harm and a very narrow, very, very focused benefit. And that is fundamentally a mispricing. And in what the economists will tell you is this is a classic tragedy of the commons problem, which is if you don't have rules around what you're allowed to do and not to do that are enforced, the reference is to pastures in old English villages. And if you had no rules about who could graze the pasture, everybody would have their cows grazing on it, and it would ruin the pasture. And that was called the tragedy of the commons. Yeah. And with ESG, that's what we got, right? So if you think about the ones that worked, Clean Air Act, just as an example. What you had, or even better example would be the hole in the ozone layer.
The ozone layer, yeah.
Remember that? Well, we had a clearly defined problem. We had a clearly defined villain, right? It was CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And the entire kind of world united around this stamping out CFC mission. And we did it. You know, and it happened, and the hole in the ozone layer closed up, and we don't hear about it anymore. So one of the fundamental problems with ESG goals is you're never going to be able to get it fixed if you can't fix the pricing problem. And you can't fix the pricing problem one company at a time. It has to be a whole group of companies either saying, we all agree we're going to operate with this, because there's always going to be some player that breaks the rules and makes more money, right? I mean, that's the fundamental problem. So if I look at something like textile supply chains, a company like Nike, some years back, investigative reporters found out that essentially there were children working as slaves in Nike, in sweatshops producing Nike clothing. And that was a terrible, terrible hit to their brand and everything else. But Nike can't be by themselves making this happen, right? Nike's got to enlist, in this case, a whole bunch of other cooperative agencies to self-police. But that's really where government has to play a role. I mean, it's government, after all, that sort of says, here's the lines of what's okay and what's not. Like, it's not okay to just walk over to your neighbor's yard and help yourself to whatever they want. We have property rights that say that's not okay. So until government really gets its act together in terms of what's okay and not okay to do in the environment, it's very hard for one company to solve that on their own.
Right. So this is like the ultimate ecosystem need and requirement.
It's a real natural ecosystem.
Existential, if you must.
Yeah, as my friend Amy Edmondson likes to say, people ask her things like, well, is the planet going to be okay? And she's like, oh, the planet's going to be fine. The species, I'm not so sure, but the planet's going to be fine.
Right. Right. Some species will rule eventually, but may not be us. Tell me a little bit, and after this, I'd love you to sort of free associate on anything I haven't asked you about. But do you feel like in this kind of environment, theory leads practice or practice leads theory? Because I keep like back to the first question I asked. I think about like chaebols or curetzos, when they worked, they were hugely beneficial for the system, the economy, the innovation, etc. And then when they sort of got crystallized and stultified, that's when the evils came into being. And so how are we going to manage for that sort of recognition that this is just a new current version of an effort that's been ongoing, and will our recognition of theory improve our practices?
Well, I'd like to respond to that in a slightly different way. So I think the thing about theories, good theories, is that they force you to articulate the boundary conditions under which a particular cause and effect relationship works or doesn't, right? And so if you take something like digitization, which to me has been a big inflection point, it's dramatically changed the amount of information you can convey across distance, the amount of rich information you can convey across distance. So there's been a huge sea change in what's possible. So a different theory, the same theory is a perfectly good theory, but it won't work in that boundary condition because it makes the assumption information moves slowly. Let's just take as an example. So if I go back to, say, our traditional theories in strategy, right? We assumed industries exist. We assume their normal state is equilibrium. We assume that, change is the unusual thing. And all of those things come into question in a world that's like the one we get now. So I think boundary conditions is the first thing. The second thing is we have to get really smarter about a kind of logic. And so most people are familiar with deductive reasoning. If X, then Y, right? We're familiar with inductive reasoning, right? I observe 3 squirrels. They all run when the car door honks, so I can induce that there's a common mechanism at play. What we don't talk about so much is abductive reasoning, which is I observe these patterns in the environment, and because I've observed those patterns, I infer a causality that's not necessarily obvious or testable. And that's really the kind of logic that managers use, right? That leaders use. It's that abductive ability to say, I can go into my experience and I can make analogies to this, or I can, pull bits of relevant patterns together to show what this could be. And I don't think we think enough about that kind of reasoning.
Right. And, once you've, in a way, it allows you to come up with a hypothesis and then maybe test it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. And so we are all in the midst then of a tremendous experiment. And so we'll have to watch, but I suspect that, the better we are at learning to play nicely and productively, like you said, the Nadelas of the world, I think the better all of us would be. Anything else you would like to talk about as we sort of start wrapping up on this extremely interesting discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we're on the cusp of understanding a new kind of leadership, which we see about us. And Satya Nadella would be an example, where the job of the leader is not so much, being up on the horse telling people what to do, as it is providing the context in which people go about doing what they do. So it's much more about context. It's much more about shaping the environment rather than specifically saying, go do this, go do that. And I think it's a model that a lot of leaders really struggle with. The other thing I think that's challenge is our way of selecting leaders is often not all that evolved rather. So I was with a company just yesterday, and they've got this model for leaders. What's a leader? A leader is big physically. A leader is a man. A leader has a deep voice. A leader is very outgoing. A leader is very expressive. And there's an awful lot of people in that organization who aren't like that. And they're kind of looking at this archetype of what a leader is, and they're going, well, do I have a future here? Because that's not how I lead. So I think we need to get smarter about what does it really mean to be a good leader, and increasingly it's things like having empathy for people, being a good listener, creating webs of inclusion, hearing from people at various levels in the hierarchy, not just the people that are in your immediate group. And so I think you got the need to really rethink what leadership looks like, and you add the ecosystem dimension into it, and now you're kind of leader as partner, not leader as dominant player, leader as partner.
Right. And a leader who can see that winner doesn't take all. Winner makes sure that everyone gets something, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, I think leadership is one of those areas that'll continue evolving, and hopefully we're listening really hard to some of these the sort of messages coming back from the front lines and from the new generations entering the workforce. Right? So, well, thank you, Professor McGrath. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope you continue pushing our thinking forward every day.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.